All right, we're going to get going here. Today, we are doing hazardous materials. Manage the storage and disposal of hazardous and/or regulated materials is a task. So laws related to documentation, storage, and transportation, often called cradle to grave. So from when it is made to when you dispose of it. A hazardous waste is a waste that poses risk to public health and exhibits one or more of the following characteristics. It's flammable, it rusts, it's corrosive, toxic, like a poison, it's reactive, which would make it explosive or an acid or something, and ecotoxic, harmful to the environment or a specific ecosystem, kills plants and animals, basically. So these laws have been around in the US for a while, and I don't know how hard they are testing you on the US laws anymore, but they used to test you on this stuff. It doesn't hurt to know them. U.S. Federal Resource Conservation Act, RCRA, from 1976, states that hazardous waste must be tracked from the time they are generated until the time they are ultimately disposed of or recycled. So a lot of these laws came along in the 70s and early 80s because of things like the Love Canal, which was a canal upstate New York that was just open sewer full of hazardous waste. And then the 60s, the Cuyahoga River through downtown Cleveland caught on fire because they were dumping so much crud into it. So about the 1970s, they figured, well, we probably better start cleaning this mess up. So then a lot of these laws came around then. So we also have the U.S. Comprehensive Environmental Responsibility, Compensation, and Liability Act, otherwise known as CERCLA. This is the act from 1980 that created what's known as the Superfund. So it's designed to help clean up sites contaminated with hazardous substances, such as Hanford, Washington, where they made some of the plutonium for the World War II atomic bombs. And they had a bad habit of just throwing stuff down into wells, whether it was radioactive or not. Hazardous Materials Transportation Act from 1975 regulates the interstate transportation of hazardous materials through the Department of Transportation. And the Hazard Communication Standards from 1983, also known as the Right to Know Law. So this law created the MSDS, which is now called the SDS, or Safety Data Sheet. It used to be called the Material Safety Data Sheet. It's regulated by OSHA, and basically what the SDS does, you post that by the material so the workers can read exactly what it is they're messing with and how to protect themselves against the stuff. In the EU, they have a WE directive, which is waste from electrical and electronic equipment. It's all about recycling and recovery targets for electrical goods. It makes the producers responsible for financing elimination of hazardous waste. So the other thing about European laws is the liability is perpetual and never ends. If it creates a problem 50 years from now, the person that generated or the company that generated it still is liable for it. Restriction of Hazardous Substances Directive, ROHS, this is another EU directive. The use of 6 hazardous materials in the manufacture of various types of electronic and electrical equipment. It's closely linked to the one above, the WEEE. It's part of a legislation initiative to solve the problem of huge amounts of toxic electronic waste, computers, televisions, all that good kind of stuff. Organizational values and policies. So the organization is responsible from cradle to grave. Cradle is when it's generated, the waste is generated in production. Grave is when it's either recycled or disposed of permanently. Supply management's goal with hazardous waste is to be prepared. So the essential point is to be proactive in dealing with hazardous materials. Avoid future exposure by permanently disposing of hazardous waste and do it correctly. Creatively turn costs of compliance into profits from environmental leadership. It'd be good for PR. And the collection programs ensure that internal controls are established to collect and ship waste to a disposal facility within the prescribed time frame. Usually 90 days. So now remember 90 days. That's not a lot of questions. Set up dedicated receptacles in the workplace for things like battery, paper, glass, aluminum, other metal. Risks. It's a contractual. No legally sound way to transfer risk or responsibility for a hazardous material to a third party. So the initial user is responsible for damage or contamination caused by the substance, the person that generates the substance, from the time it is originally shipped to the user until the substance is destroyed or degraded. So the use of indemnification clauses can help mitigate the risk, but only when it's not in your possession. Boeing ran into a problem in the 1980s where they were contracting with a third party to dispose of their hazardous waste. And all this guy was doing was he had a farm down in Kent and he threw some blue tarps down and he was collecting waste from a number of people and he was just dumping it in this hole. And the way that they found out about it was the birds thought it was a lake and they would go down and land on the lake and immediately die. So they finally got a hold of this guy and they basically put him in jail. But they came back against Boeing, and Boeing said, it's not our problem. We sold it to this guy. And the federal government said, oh, but it is your problem. You're going to pay to clean it up. So insurance, make sure the supplier as well as the supply management organization has an adequate insurance. Obtain insurance certificates of coverage before releasing the material. So make sure the disposal company has insurance. And insurance rates for hazardous materials can be lower if the company can show they will not be in the first position in the event of a claim. But if you generated the waste and it's on your premises, you'll be in the first position. Place the disposal company's carrier in the first position. That can be done. Legal liability will follow ownership, or in other words, the initial user. It is safe to assume some legal disposal methods may become illegal in the future and require cleanup. So if your disposal method is somewhat sketchy today, probably won't be good in the future. Current disposal plans should consider both present and future and possible future liability. The Hazardous Communications Standard, which is the SDS, requires company to provide the safety data sheets. And it's constructed to conform to the UN Global Harmonized System with the use of a standard format. So people around the world can understand where stuff's at. Environmental 2 laws require the cleanup of hazardous waste. There's CERCLA from 1980 that created the Superfund Act and the Act on Prevention and Remedying Damage to the Environment, Environmental Damage Act. Usually you don't see questions on that one, but you will see questions on CERCLA. Ethical issues, not a good idea to work with suppliers you think may have questionable ethics, no matter how cheap their services. Moving hazardous materials between countries, comply with the stricter of the 2 laws. And then audit, internal, at least an annual audit is recommended for companies' entire hazardous waste materials policy. And the audit consists of a series of questions. Some examples included on, I'll show you a document here in a minute. Supply chain, responsibility of purchasing to ensure that suppliers are meeting the legal requirements. Due diligence liability assessment could be performed. Cradle to grave, the user responsible for the waste from the time it is created to the time it is either disposed of or rendered inert. And cradle to cradle. So cradle to grave is what most common, from time it's generated to the time it's permanently disposed of. Cradle to cradle, on the other hand, is the products are designed with the goal of waste-free life cycle. So products are broken down into both technical nutrients and biological nutrients. So the technical nutrients can be recycled or reused, and the biological nutrients can be composted. Purchasing's main job, purchasing's main job in a hazardous material policy is to qualify sources, make sure they have insurance. Here's HAZMAT policy audit from questions from ISM. This is not what I thought it was. There we go. That is just a series of questions that supply chain can use to audit a supplier. Generators of hazardous waste must report their activity to the state environmental agency. So there's the Federal Environmental Agency, or EPA, and there's also a state environmental agency. A biennial, which is every other year, report is required for companies that produce more than 1 ton of waste in a month. I don't know that anybody in the trucking industry does, although if we start making our own batteries, we may be liable to something like that. The generator must receive a uniform hazardous waste manifest with the signature of the owner of the disposal facility. And generators must also maintain records for waste determination, manifest retention, and land disposal restrictions, determination and certification, and employee training. So there's a lot of record keeping that must be done, and there's certain requirements for a number of years that needs to be kept. So the contractor should provide certificates of disposal after the disposal is complete. That certifies that he disposed of it properly. It's necessary for the generator to track the shipment to the collection site to ensure that proper steps are taken. Because remember, ultimately, the generator is still liable for it. And then you've got the ISM principles of sustainability and social responsibility. And they look like, I think we've seen this before a few times. They look like this. And then there's what, 11 principles. Basically, though, encourage the organization to be proactive, hold suppliers accountable, champion environmental responsible products, and support and influence the design of products to be effective. There's a few others. Embed environmentally responsible language, conduct environmental audits. So this is the PACCAR checklist for suppliers. Comes from the PACCAR corporate environmental. So here's the audit checklist for a large facility, small facility, and some recommendations. And I emailed them to ask if we actually do audit our suppliers. I don't think we do, unless they're, we may, I just don't think we do. I think we audit our own facilities, and that's what our environmental guys do. But this is the PACCAR audit document here, review checklist. And this is their website. And then here's the ISM checklist for the same type of thing. A little bit shorter, a little bit more straightforward. Internationally recognized organizations that will help with environmental audits. The FFC, nonprofit, Global Environmental Management Initiative, GEMI, consultants, Social Venture Network, another nonprofit, and World Environmental Center, another nonprofit. And then there's customer-driven requirements, expectation from customers and organizations that and their suppliers or supply base with whom they do business act in a responsible manner. And this is true for consumer products companies and anybody else. If you want to get bad rep and get in trouble with hot water real quick, start polluting environmental hazard stuff all over the place, and the news will take notice of you very quickly. Environmental regulatory agencies often publish names of non-compliant organizations, and many organizations adopt policies that integrate environmental protection and stewardship as part of their business strategy. They all say that, but do they actually walk the walk? All right. Which of the U.S. acts provides for the cleanup and remediation of closed and abandoned hazardous waste sites? So, oops, think um, Hanford. And the answer should be CERCLA. Option A, it is CERCLA. Okay, next one. Primary purpose of the U.S. Federal Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA, record-keeping system is to what? So a couple of these you can cross off pretty quickly. Number B, it's not a SOX thing. And number D, provide a vehicle to assess penalties. It's like, yeah, it's not really why it's there. So ensure validation methodology of assessing damages and liabilities for violators. That's not really in the spirit of the legislation, but rather track the life cycle of the hazardous waste. That's probably more likely. So C. C it is. Okay, there's 9 questions out there, so go ahead and get going on them. And we will go over answers at 3:55. All right, let's go over some answers here. Number one is a Bravo. 45 days is correct amount of time required for notification. Has to be done by 90 days. So if you cut that in half, 45 will give you some room to make things happen. Two is also Bravo. Jill's liability for hazardous materials does not begin until her organization takes ownership of it. By specifying a delivered at place, her organization does not take ownership of the material until it reaches her facilities. Three, Charlie. The DOT, or Department of Transportation, has authority for the movement of hazardous materials over the highways. Four is Alpha. In case of regulated hazardous materials, liability will follow ownership, and anything that connects hazardous goods to their owners will generally be sufficient to establish a link. Five is Bravo. Internal audit is not part of supply management because it's an internal audit. Six is Charlie. Because the SDS is provided by the supplier. The person that provides the material has to provide the SDS, not the company receiving it. Seven is Charlie. Also, the RCRA was passed in 76 and focuses on the paperwork for managing hazardous waste. And eight is Bravo. CERCLA is the one that created the law that created the Superfund and cleanup requirements. And nine is Delta. The U.S. EPA, or Environmental Protection Agency, is the one that implements and enforces federal laws relating to clean water and air. All right, that's what I got for you today. Tomorrow we work on E6.